Yo, what's up everyone? Ludi here with my very first guide to Succ Ranger PvP. I know it's been a long time coming, I've been promising a full guide for a while, but I really wanted to make sure to cover as much as I could. Honestly, there's just a lot to cover, and even with a 40-minute video, there's still a lot of details I had to leave off. As far as Succ Ranger PvP goes, I would say that there's two main aspects to learn, which are mechanics and positioning. I thought it was just a bit too much to squeeze both into just a single video, so this will be part 1 of the guide, where we will focus on solely the mechanics of Succ Ranger. Even so, I tried to make this guide as comprehensive as possible, without being too overbearing so you guys can understand exactly how the class works. Do keep in mind this is a PvP only guide, as I don't do much PvE on this class, but I can link some Succ Ranger PvE guides in the description below that you can check out. As far as the format of this guide goes, we'll first give an overview of all the skills just so you can see exactly what they do. Then we'll take a closer look at movement, protections, CCs, and damage mechanics for some of our trickier cancels. Lastly, we'll go over some sample combos and then go over some RBF gameplay while I give some commentary. With that, let's get right into it. Razor Wind is a ranged skill that recently got buffs to its damage and attack speed. It does moderate damage by itself, however, Razor Wind only has a 20% crit rate by itself, so the damage can scale well with additional crit rate. In terms of protections, it is one of our only skills with forward guard. The forward guard is nice in that the direction of the forward guard follows the direction your camera is facing. It can also be used on cooldown, but it'll have less damage, no forward guard, so I don't recommend it on cooldown unless you're using it to flow into other skills, which I'll cover later. Evasive Explosion Shot, or EES for short, is your main iframe skill with a short 7-second cooldown. You can use this skill up to twice in a row with iframe both times, and you do not have to use the skill in the same direction both times. When using the skill to the left or right side, you can linger the iframe a little bit. EES also got a recent buff where the backwards iframe can also linger, but the linger is still not as long as when you use it to the side. Be careful when lingering the skill too long between the first and second jumps, or else you might accidentally use a non-iframe jump for the second jump. This skill also has a stiffen in PvP, which you can capitalize on. Evasive Landing Shot, or ELS for short, is another great movement skill with only a 5-second cooldown. You cannot use this skill by itself, but instead you can cast ELS by using Shift RB after certain movement skills such as EES, Riding the Wind, Twisting Wind, or Shotgun, which is Extreme Charging Wind. This skill recently got buffed with iframe at the beginning of the skill instead of before where it was only super armor. Twisting Wind and Riding the Wind are some more great movement skills both on a 4-second cooldown and are generally used together. The two skills together move you a considerable distance and are both super armor when off cooldown. You can also use them when on cooldown for the same distance but without any protections, which can be very helpful for traveling extra distance quickly. The two skills are very similar but do have some minor differences. First of all, when both skills are off cooldown, Twisting Wind will always be used first, and it moves a slightly longer distance than Riding the Wind. Riding the Wind can always be used after Twisting Wind, but it can also be used on its own by using either AD plus spacebar during either Call to the Sky, which is WRMB, or during EES. Charging Wind is an easy to use, high damage protected charged ranged skill, and is one of the highest damaging skills in your kit. Currently, there's no way of skipping the charging animation. After the skill is fully charged, you can walk around with the skill while maintaining the full charge with super armor, but be careful because walking around drains your stamina very quickly. The skill has potential to do a lot of damage because it has a knockdown effect and has air attack on it. which means that if you hit the knockdown with Charging Wind, the air attack damage also gets applied, giving you a massive damage boost. Even without getting the knockdown, Charging Wind still does considerable damage. You can also get a fully charged Charging Wind even when it's on cooldown by charging up and walking around, and it will gain the super armor and knockdown effect as soon as you start walking. Charging Wind without being fully charged is also a great skill on its own. Not fully charged Charging Wind still has super armor and also has the knockback effect. This is a great way to get a fast, ranged protected CC on an enemy while still being protected. Bypassing Wind is one of the most important skills in the Ranger toolkit. It is a skill that is mostly used to be able to transition into Tearing Arrow smoothly. I will go more in depth into Bypassing Wind and Tearing Arrow interactions in a separate section later on. Prime Extreme Charging Wind is the skill more commonly known as Shotgun. Shotgun recently got buffed with 100% crit rate when off cooldown and does moderate down attack damage in a cone-shaped area in front of you, but more importantly, is one of your most reliable forward guards on a 3-second cooldown. You can use Shotgun by using spacebar after any other movement skill, as well as almost every damage skill other than Descending Current and Penetrating Wind, as well as Bomb skills. Just like Razor Wind, the forward guard from Shotgun can be turned to face the direction your camera is facing. Although the skill can be cancelled out of, you can linger the forward guard for quite a while. Tearing Arrow is one of your bread and butter damage skills and is one of the best skills for large amounts of sustained ranged damage. This is because even though Tearing Arrow technically has a 7-second cooldown, Tearing Arrow still does over 90% of its normal damage even when on cooldown, and also has down attack, letting you do massive damage by capitalizing on your knockdowns. Although you can charge up Tearing Arrow manually, there are many ways to skip the charge up animation from a variety of scenarios, letting you use fully charged Tearing Arrow at almost any time, and mastery of using Tearing Arrow while skipping the charge is essential to the success of the class. We will go over all the ways to use Tearing Arrow in depth later on in the video, but another thing to note about Tearing Arrow is that although it says super armor only applies while charging and while holding the skill in between shots, but it does not apply while shooting. This means that we can essentially regard Tearing Arrow as an unprotected skill. Blasting Gust is one of your main spammable movement skills and is pretty easy to use with just Direction Key and LMB. This skill recently got a stamina buff, now costing only 70 stamina instead of 100, making it much more spammable than before. You might find that Blasting Gust can stutter when starting to move forward or backwards, especially when you're trying to cancel other skills with Blasting Gust. To get around this, you can add Q to your forward and backwards Blasting Gust to cancel straight into the movement. Also, despite what the skill description says, you don't want to use Q by itself, as this will try to put you into an awkward backward spinning animation. Blasting Gust is also a ranged knockdown on a 7-second cooldown, and is one of your best skills for catching unsuspecting enemies. Blasting Gust is also your primary evasion debuff, with a huge minus 12% evasion debuff on hit. Overall, Blasting Gust doubles as both one of your best tools for getting a ranged knockdown, as well as being a spammable movement skill, which will both put Blasting Gust on cooldown. These two priorities can often be in conflict, so be sure to keep that in mind and manage the cooldown accordingly. Prime Ultimate Blasting Gust is a skill that should be used on your hotbar and is essentially a forward guard attack without a CC that does damage in a cone-shaped area in front of you. Just like Razor Wind and Shotgun, you can also camera turn the direction of the forward guard to wherever you are currently facing. Other than casting the skill from the hotbar, you can also activate the skill with LMB after Tearing Shot, which is one of your bombs. This skill is useful for doing protected damage if you're backed into a corner with no other options. Absolute Will of the Wind is mostly not used, and you can disregard it completely if you're just starting to learn Succ Ranger. For those that are curious, it's basically a unprotected melee range skill, that most importantly gives a minus 15 range DP debuff, and can be added into some combos if they're already in melee range. Penetrating Wind is a fast casting, ranged nuke skill with a short cooldown of 7 seconds. Penetrating Wind also got a big buff recently with the addition of Knockdown instead of the previous stun effect. Penetrating Wind also has air attack, and just like Charging Wind, this means that you can get the air attack extra damage if you get the knockdown effect while using the skill. Because Penetrating Wind is a knockdown now, it is a great skill for getting an initial CC, or can be used as a great re-CC. While Penetrating Wind can be used from the hotbar for about 20 to 30% extra damage, I personally do not recommend this because of the relative immobility while casting. Since this skill has many ways to be casted, I will go over the mechanics more in depth later on in the damage section of this video, in its own section. Descending Current is one of the most recognizable skills in our skill set. It does a large amount of damage in a giant AoE in front of you. You can use this skill by hotbarring Prime, Descending Current, and then holding L and B to go into the flow, which will do all the rest of the hits. Descending Current can also hit people on elevation and can also hit below you, and you can hit people standing at different elevations at the same time. When using Descending Current upwards, you can hit at an angle of about 30 degrees above the ground, whereas Downward Descending Current recently got a buff where you can hit much farther below you than before. In addition, Descending Current gets bound on the first hit, as well as down attack, letting you do massive damage if you get the bound effect. Descending Current and its flow both have a cooldown of 10 seconds, and also can be used when it's on cooldown, although it has much less damage, so I generally only recommend it to use it while off cooldown. Binding Arrow is a Magnus skill and is our ranged float. Although you can cast it with down F directly, you can also cast it by using F while using Razor Wind, Shotgun, Tearing Arrow, Regeneration, as well as Bomb Squall Shot and Tearing Shot. It does have a considerable cast time and travel time, so you are relatively stuck in place whenever you're casting it. For these reasons, I recommend that the skill should generally only be used as a re-CC option. This is a relatively new skill, so I'm still playing with it as well, and I encourage you to test with it on your own as well. Prime Feathers of the Spirits is our E-buff, and should be locked and hotbarred to avoid any key conflicts. This skill recently got a big buff with plus 20 AP instead of the 15% evasion it had before. This boost also gives us 30% attack speed, 20% crit rate, 30% move speed, and 15% accuracy as well. The last thing to note is that this skill lets us full sprint without consuming stamina. Nature's Tremble is a melee range forward guard that does reasonable damage. Other than damage, this skill also has a minus 20 DP debuff on hit, as well as getting buffed recently with HP on hit. Just like Prime Ultimate Blasting Gust, this skill is also useful for doing protected damage if you're backed into a wall with no other options. Nature's Tremble comes in two parts, which consist of the windup and the damage, and can be mouse moved during the windup phase to adjust the positioning of the forward guard during the damage phase, but the direction will remain stationary after that. Regeneration is a melee range knockdown that is unprotected with moderate damage. Even though it is technically a melee skill, it still reaches a reasonable distance of about this far and is very useful as a re-CC if you're in range or can get in range of your opponents easily. This skill is one of our only pre-buffs, giving us 10% attack speed for 10 seconds on a 12-second cooldown. Be careful when you cast this though, as you are unprotected for a relatively long animation. Succession Call from Sky is another super armor movement skill by using WRB, and this skill jumps you forward just a little bit. Call from Sky also has a few flows by continuing to hold RMB, and they are prioritized in this order. Number 1. If Flow Air Explosion Shot is off cooldown, the 12-second cooldown will be used, and you will do a second leap that makes you jump even higher into the air. Number 2. If Air Explosion Shot is on cooldown and EES iframe is off cooldown, Call from Sky will flow into an iframe forward leap. This will burn your EES cooldown, however, so keep that in mind. If both Air Explosion Shot and EES iframe are on cooldown, Call from Sky will flow into a forward leap similar to Air Explosion Shot, but doesn't jump nearly as high and is also unprotected. So any of this movement can also be mouse moved if you like. It's great for making weird jumps that can't be made by jumping in a straight line. You can also use Call to Sky by spamming the base version without any flows. Although it looks like you have full SA on movement with a small gap at the end, the reality is if you get hit during this animation, you can get hit stuttered, which will speed up the super armor and leave you with a bigger gap at the end. So do keep in mind when using this skill. Call from Sky also scales with additional jump height, letting you jump onto siege walls with the additional height, especially with the extra height from Air Explosion Shot. However, you might run into falling animation problems if you use it to jump too high. One last thing to note is that Call from Sky can have trouble jumping over objects if you start right next to them. So to get around this, you should start the Call from Sky from further back if you need to climb over objects. Overall, Call from Sky is a good last resort super armor movement option, which you will get caught in from time to time because of the hit stutter. Call of the Earth is our other self buff that gives 9% accuracy for 20 seconds when you use it, but it can only be used every 60 seconds. This accuracy buff stacks with all other accuracy buffs, including our E buff. These are the 3 Rabomb skills you should take for PvP. For the level 56 Rabomb, take Tearing Shot. Tearing Shot is an unprotected stun with minimal damage and has a bit of a wind up. When using the skill, you can hold shift to hold onto the skill, and it will fire whenever you let go of shift. After releasing, you can also combo into Prime Ultimate Blasting Gust with LMB. Overall, Tearing Shot only has really niche usage, especially in large scale, because of the wind up and the fact that we generally have better CCs at our disposal. But it is useful in certain matchups, and I would recommend you to experiment with it on your own. For the level 57 Rabomb, take Fury Arrow. Fury Arrow is an unprotected skill with minimal damage, but with great CC potential as a rapid fire knockback. Every single tick of Fury Arrow is a knockback, and you can keep firing it as long as you have stamina. If you do happen to get a knockback, you can use Q while in Fury Arrow stance to use Blasting Gust to get a knockdown as a good follow-up. Alternatively, you can also use Shift LMB while in Fury Arrow stance to fire a penetrating wind. If you need to be protected instead, you can also cancel out with E for Razor Wind to grant you a forward guard, or with a movement skill with something like EES. Overall, Fury Arrow is a great way to peel your allies, but it also has limited use in large scale because of the limited damage and relative immobility. For the level 58 Rabomb, I highly recommend taking Wind Explosion Shot. This skill got some major changes recently, and now it is much easier to use than before. Although it can be used directly from the hotbar, Wind Explosion Shot has now been changed to be able to be used by LMB after Evasive Landing Shot. Although I highly recommend Wind Explosion Shot, the other level 58 Rabomb, Will of Descending Current, is also decent and also got buffed. In my opinion though, having Wind Explosion Shot is generally preferred because of the extra utility of the protected movement. Let's talk about movement. Ranger movement got buffed recently, and now it's actually really hard to run out of stamina unless you're spamming Blasting Gust too much. So we went over movement skills all individually before, but I just want to take some time to put it together. So just to recap, all your movement skills are Blasting Gust, Evasive Explosion Shot, Twisting Wind and Riding the Wind, Shotgun, Evasive Landing Shot, Call to Sky, and Wind Explosion Shot. So the nice thing about Succ Ranger movement is that all the movement skills are fluid in that you can use them in pretty much almost any order. The only real exceptions to this are that Evasive Landing Shot cannot be used first, and Wind Explosion Shot is best used after Evasive Landing Shot. One thing to note about all these movement skills is that they can all be used when on cooldown, to get the same movement but without protection. The only exceptions to this rule are evasive landing shot and wind explosion shot. So because you can use them in any order, you can tailor your movement to the situation. So I'll just show you a few examples. Okay, let's say you really need to dodge a big damage diver, such as an Awakened Dracania. Here you can use both of your iframes up front and then go from there. So another example, let's say that you're in the middle of shooting Tearing Arrow and a wizard is TPing in front of you and is threatening to CC you. From Tearing Arrow, you can go into Shotgun to block the damage with your frontal, then either iframe or super armor movement away as a follow-up. You might notice with all these movement skills that you don't quite have enough protected movement to do an endless protected rotation, so you might have to find some time to squeeze in some unprotected movement, or just use Call to Sky as buffer. Call to Sky does keep you somewhat protected, but it is slow moving and is vulnerable to hit stuttering as we mentioned before. As far as protections from damage skills go, we do have a few options. For example, our forward guards are Nature's Tremble, Prime Ultimate Blasting Gust, Razor Wind, and Shotgun. After all these skills, you can go into Shotgun to extend the forward guard. Don't forget that all of these forward guard skills have the ability to change the direction of the forward guard with either a camera turn or mouse movement. As far as super armor damage goes, you basically have one option, which is Charging Wind. Charging Wind is a pretty stacked skill, to be honest. It's your only super armor damage and is fairly spammable, and also comes with great CCs and damage. I personally like to use this skill a lot as kind of a waiting move if I feel like I need some time to stop and figure out what to do next. Lastly, I just want to note that when traveling long distances, the best way is to simply put your weapon away and run normally. Succ Ranger gets a 10% move speed passive, and the E-buff also gives 30% move speed. When you need to get your weapon back out again, one easy way is to use Blasting Gust straight out of running. Just remember that you should not use Blasting Gust with Q when using it when your weapon is put away, otherwise you'll end up doing the forward crouch roll. Let's talk about damage. Since your main source of damage on Succ Ranger comes from Tearing Arrow and Penetrating Wind, it is super important to understand all the mechanics available at your disposal. In this section, I'll show you all the ways to use Tearing Arrow, Penetrating Wind, and Bypassing Wind, and all the interactions between them. Let's start with Penetrating Wind. Penetrating Wind is a very fast, high burst damage skill. The quickest and by far the most common way of using Penetrating Wind is with either Shift LMB or Shift RMB during either Razor Wind or Tearing Arrow. Another way of using Penetrating Wind is that you can do the kick cancel. You have to unlock round kick to do this, but the way that works is that round kick needs to hit something, and then you flow into Penetrating Wind afterwards with Shift LMB. So obviously that only really works in melee range. However, you can do this by hitting a Blasting Gust from range, using the kick, and then firing Penetrating Wind right after. So the way this works is that you just need to hit something while the kick is going off, and then the flow works as normal. If you don't hit anything with the Blasting Gust, the Penetrating Wind won't go off, and you're kind of just stuck in this awkward animation. So I personally don't use the kick cancel anymore just because the animations are really long and awkward, especially if you miss, which can be really devastating as you can just get killed really easily. So normally I'll just use the Razor Wind cancel instead. The one advantage of the kick cancel, however, is that you can preserve your Razor Wind cooldown. Another way of using Penetrating Wind is with either Shift LMB or Shift RMB after Evasive Landing Shot. This is a really good way to catch people with a knockdown while you're kiting them. A couple more ways you can use Penetrating Wind is with Shift LMB during Prime Ultimate Blasting Gust or after Binding Arrow. Tearing Arrow is one of your main damage skills for sustained damage. As we said before, Tearing Arrow is a skill with a charge up. However, you don't want to ever charge the skill manually. Let's go over all the ways to skip the charge up animation for Tearing Arrow. You can use a fully charged Tearing Arrow directly after Evasive Explosion Shot. All you need to do is input in down E as Evasive Explosion Shot is landing, and you will end up in fully charged Tearing Arrow stance. Similarly, you can do the same thing after twisting the wind and riding the wind. You can also do the same thing after Evasive Landing Shot. And you can also do the same thing after Regeneration. All other Tearing Arrow cancels involve a skill called Bypassing Wind. Bypassing Wind isn't a skill to use by itself, but instead, anytime you use Bypassing Wind, you can always queue up a full charged Tearing Arrow right afterwards. Okay, let me say that again. Anytime you use Bypassing Wind, you can always queue up a full charged Tearing Arrow afterwards. Bypassing Wind looks similar to Blasting Gust, but you can always recognize it because it's kind of green and purple. Bypassing Wind can have a different key input depending on what skill you're using it after. Let's go over all of these now and see how we get into Tearing Arrow from Bypassing Wind. You can always use Bypassing Wind after Penetrating Wind with Shift RMB. This is very convenient because we already use Shift RMB to do Penetrating Wind off of Razor Wind and Tearing Arrow, so we just need to hold Shift RMB a little longer to trigger Bypassing Wind. After that, we need to queue up down E while Bypassing Wind is going off to get into Tearing Arrow stance. So one step at a time, it looks like this. So this is Razor Wind into Penetrating Wind. This is Razor Wind into Penetrating Wind and then Bypassing Wind. And this is Razor Wind into Penetrating Wind and Bypassing Wind, and then Tearing Arrow after the Bypassing Wind. Okay, now, because you can do Penetrating Wind after Tearing Arrow, you can activate Bypassing Wind again after that as well, letting you go back to Tearing Arrow again. So you can literally do this in a loop forever. You can also use Bypassing Wind directly after Tearing Arrow while shooting by adding RMB to the LMB of Tearing Arrow. So once again, you can queue up down E for Tearing Arrow while Bypassing Wind is going off. This is a good way for shooting off of elevation. If you find yourself moving backwards slightly in this animation, this is because the last tick of Tearing Arrow will move you backwards. So what you can do to avoid this is just use Bypassing Wind before the last tick of Tearing Arrow, and you can avoid the kickback of the last tick of Tearing Arrow. Speaking of using Tearing Arrow off of elevation, you can also activate Bypassing Wind through Razor Wind by once again adding RMB to the LMB of Razor Wind and queuing up down E once again. This is a great way to start using Tearing Arrow while standing perfectly still. In a similar fashion, you can also activate Bypassing Wind after a normal left-click auto attack. Once again, add RMB to your LMB and queue up down E. This is a great way to do the same thing as with Razor Wind, but has the advantage of not putting Razor Wind on cooldown. The last way to start Tearing Arrow while standing still, we've already mentioned before, but just to say again, we can do Regeneration into down E to start using Tearing Arrow while standing still. The last way to activate Bypassing Wind, and in my opinion one of the best and most fluid ways, is after Blasting Gust. How to do this cancel is by far one of the most popular questions that I get on my stream, and is probably one of the trickiest cancels in the entire kit to do consistently. So to explain how this works, I'm going to show it one step at a time. First, we do a side blasting gust with left LMB. Next, we can add bypassing wind with left LMB RMB. And finally, while bypassing wind is firing, we can queue up a down E as usual. You can also do the same thing to the right side as well as backwards, but forwards is a little more awkward. So this might sound straightforward, but it does require some timing to get consistently. Also, any attack speed buffs or slows will definitely change the timing, so you will need to adjust accordingly. A lot of things can go wrong when you're starting to learn this, so I'm going to go over some of the common issues you might face when learning this cancel. First of all, if your character starts to hard cast a tearing arrow, that means you're probably waiting a bit too long to input down E. Next, if your character stops and shoots backwards, this can be a couple things. It can mean that you aren't letting go of LMB RMB while inputting down E. This would cause you to trigger down LMB, which is just blasting gust backwards. So for a similar reason, it could also mean that you're using LMB to try to start shooting tearing arrow too soon. Remember that your character needs to be prepped in the tearing arrow ready stance before you can start shooting with LMB. Let's talk about CCs and combos. Succ Ranger has a lot of CCs at its disposal, and they are all relevant in some form or another. Let's list them all once again. For knockdowns, we have Blasting Gust, Penetrating Wind, Charging Wind, and Regeneration. For knockbacks, we have Tearing Arrow, Uncharged Charging Wind, and Fury Arrow. We have one Float, which is Binding Arrow, one Bound, which is Descending Current, and one Stun, which is our Rabomb Tearing Shot. Finally, and we have one Stiff, which is our iframe Evasive Explosion Shot. Not all these CCs are created equal, of course. The best CCs in the entire kit are definitely Blasting Gust, Penetrating Wind, and Charging Wind, all of which are knockdowns. These are the best CCs in the kit because not only are they the most accessible, they give you the most time CC'd so you can use down attack Tearing Arrow for damage. Other than CCs, a lot of our skills also come with movement slow debuffs of 25 to 30%. I'm not going to go through all these individually, so feel free to pause to take a look. Although we have a lot of move speed slows, we do not have any attack speed slows that are usable. Let's go over some sample combos. Most Succ Ranger damage combos look pretty similar in that it's pretty much just find a way to CC them and get them on the ground and follow up with down attack Tearing Arrow. Obviously there will be way more combos than I can reasonably show, but I just wanted to give some examples of ways you can capitalize on certain CCs. Now I'm a little too geared to do full combos, so I have taken off my Debo necklace for 294 AP and around 950 accuracy. In front of me is a striker with around 510 range DR and 1150 evasion. For each combo, I will show it once at 70% speed and once at full speed. Combo 1. Here's a basic damage combo with one knockdown. Get a knockdown with either Blasting Gust or Penetrating Wind and follow up with Tearing Arrow. Also, for all these combos, I will show longer CCs such as knockdowns and floats in a red box, and shorter CCs such as knockback and stiff in a yellow box. Here's a more extended combo with two knockdowns. You can fit 2 tearing arrows in per knockdown for maximum damage. You'll notice that each bypassing wind has a different key input. This is why mastering bypassing wind and tearing arrow are essential, and I would encourage you to review the earlier section where I go over it in depth. Combo 3 is similar to Combo 2, except now we have Binding Arrow instead of Penetrating Wind as a re-CC. I personally find Binding Arrow to flow really well after Shotgun, and you can easily go into Penetrating Wind and Bypassing Wind again afterwards. You might notice that Blasting Gust and Penetrating Wind are both knockdowns and at the front, and you might be wondering why they don't both have a red box indicating a knockdown. This is because the time between Blasting Gust and Penetrating Wind is so short that it only counts as one knockdown if you apply it fast enough and won't apply the CC counter for both. Here we also have Shotgun at the end as filler damage. Combo 4 isn't really much of a combo, but really just something you can do easily from a wall. Remember, you can use fully charged Charging Wind even on cooldown by charging it and moving around when it is done charging. Combo 5 is a way to capitalize off of Charging Wind knockback. If you see the knockback, you can follow up with the Blasting Gust or Penetrating Wind for a knockdown, and use the same method as above to create another full charged Charging Wind for a re-CC, and then follow up with damage as usual. Combo 6 is possible when you get a Charging Wind knockback from close range. You can immediately follow up with Regeneration Knockdown and begin your tearing arrows with Will of the Wind for a quick 15 range damage reduction debuff. Use Penetrating Wind as a re-CC and do all your damage with Tearing Arrow. Last but not least, Combo 7 is a sample way to capitalize off of EES Stiffen. You can use Tearing Arrow directly after Regeneration, and even re-CC with Penetrating Wind after Evasive Landing Shot. This is a great way to re-CC while repositioning with Evasive Landing Shot. Okay, so we've seen a lot of movement, damage, and combos, so now it's time to put it all together. The hard part about playing Succ Ranger is that you need to find a balance between doing damage and staying safe. So I've prepared a short clip from a recent RBF with key inputs on, just so you guys can see the mechanics in action as well as hear some of my thought process while positioning. So we just start Blasting Gust forward to get close enough to do enough damage with Penetrating Wind into Tearing Arrow. He tries to run away, but we do Blasting Gust bypassing into Tearing Arrow to get into better position to hit him in the back. He looks super low, so I tried to finish him off with a quick shotgun and binding arrow, but he survives unfortunately. So now we regeneration for attack speed buff, and now we see this guy in the corner. So once again, Blasting Gust bypassing when Tearing Arrow, and he's dead. We see this guy, not sure what class he was, but I decided to play it safe with iframe into shotgun. Now we put our weapon away, run forward, because we see these guys engaging, so we go straight into damage with Blasting Gust, Penetrating Wind, bypassing when Tearing Arrow. I wasn't sure if anyone was going to try to go on me, but I used shotgun as kind of a waiting move. We see no one, so we decide to re-engage with Charging Wind, followed by more damage with Blasting Gust, bypassing Tearing Arrow. By this point, we don't think anyone's coming to attack, so we move forward, feeling confident about doing damage, but unfortunately for some reason there was a ninja in stealth here. We get CC'd, but we're okay because a Shy came to save us. But he bubbles, and I do get caught in the bubble for a while, so I kind of burned all my movement trying to get out, so we decide to Razor Wind just to buy time for our movement cooldowns, and we hop away. Immediately, I realize nobody's chasing, so straight back into Blasting Gust, bypassing and Tearing Arrow for damage. We do notice on the minimap that the sages were coming, so I prepped a Charging Wind and just got away with Evasive Expulsion Shot iframe, followed by Shotgun ELS to get even further away. We do Twisting Wind and see someone on top of us, but we see he's kind of looking the other way, and I still had enough time after Twisting Wind to go straight into Tearing Arrow, Penetrating Wind for big damage. After that, we see a lot of people around us, so we kind of just hold Charging Wind for Super Armor, just to give us time to figure out what to do next. But we see no one, so we just rebuff with Regeneration and Tree Buff. Sorry, that was kind of a pretty short clip, and I talked kind of fast there, but hopefully that should give some idea as to how the class can be played. Gearing for Succ Rangers should mostly be focused on maximizing damage. For AP, I would say a good starting point for Succ Ranger is around 305 or 309 sheet AP. After that, you want to also add in some accuracy accessories while also trying to maintain at least 309 sheet AP. As far as how much accuracy you need, really depends on who you're fighting. If you're fighting top-end siege guilds with evasion players, I would recommend at least 1000 accuracy, otherwise 900 to 950 is probably fine. For artifacts and lightstones, you can just use whatever will let you reach your accuracy goals between target openings, all-out attack, and maiming. As for cups, we do scale better with damage, so we use crit cups and AP belt. And finally, don't neglect DP. It's still pretty important. It's not going to help you survive getting comboed, but it definitely helps a ton if you trade damage or take a few hits while running away in super armor. As far as add-ons go, these are the add-ons I use for PvP. One thing to note is that bypassing wind inherits the add-ons for charging wind. So whenever your bypassing wind hits, you'll get the 30% crit rate and 10% attack speed. However, prime extreme charging wind or shotgun does not get these add-ons. That's all for this guide. Overall, Succ Ranger is a class that can dish out a lot of damage, but can be extremely vulnerable because most of our damage is unprotected, so we need to find a balance between doing damage and staying safe, especially in this era of super fast moving classes such as Awakened Dracania. I would say that Succ Ranger is not too difficult from a mechanical perspective, and that most of the challenge comes from careful positioning. We are planning to make a part 2 to this guide to talk about positioning and positioning concepts, so be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it when it comes out. Also, don't forget to follow me at twitch.tv/Ludi to catch me live, where I usually do PvP content such as Node War, Siege, and RBF. That's all for now. Good luck with your Succ Ranger PvP.